the why. Kids do that naturally when they're 3. It's a shame that sometimes they get to 30 and they've lost it and they're doing the what, but not challenging back and saying why.
Hello and welcome to the Randall Osché Podcast, where honest conversations take the lead. Each week, we sit down with entrepreneurs, artists, thinkers, and change makers to unpack how they got from there to here and what they learned along the way. Real stories, no filters, lessons earned through experience, so you can take what's useful and leave the rest. Whether you're tuning in during your commute, workout, or while making dinner, we're glad you're here. So take a seat, relax, grab a cup of tea, and join in the conversation. Now, let's get into this week's episode.
Richard Erskine, welcome to the show. Richard is the author of Trusted Knowledge in a Digital and Fragmented World, a PhD graduate of Cambridge. He spent a 30-year career as an enterprise information management consultant, is now a fellow at the Schumacher Institute, amongst other achievements, interests, and accomplishments. But Richard, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
I'm very glad to be here.
Of a man of varied interests, which I appreciate, and I think that we will dive into those very interests and how we arrived there a bit later on. One of the things upon introduction to you that I found intriguingly interesting, and I figured it would be a great starting point. And my caveat that I always say is, while this is starting in a bit of a chronological order, it is not likely to continue in a chronological order. We will be pulling on threads as we go here. But one of the things I found most intriguing from the start of your journey of what I could find online is your undergrad career was at the University of London, and then you graduated Cambridge with a PhD in chemistry, but then somehow you translated that to a 30-plus career in technology. So maybe we can go as deep back to this as you want, like maybe how you decided on University of London, got into Cambridge, why chemistry, and then how the pivot from science to technology happened.
Yeah, there was a few things that happened. I think from quite a small age, I wanted to do science. And actually at school, I didn't flourish at all. And when I got to university, in the second year, I suddenly took off like a rocket and did really well. But where I was at, which was actually City University at the time, it couldn't really give me what I needed. So I went, and I'd moved into kind of theoretical chemistry, which is like applied quantum mechanics. And so I moved to Cambridge really to work because they had a kind of world-leading department in theoretical chemistry. So that was why I moved to Cambridge. And then I did a postdoc in Bristol, which is where I met my wife. And I got into this thing of getting narrower and narrower, becoming, and a lot of researchers, I admire them because their ability to focus on a kind of niche area for decades. But I think I realized I'm just too much of butterfly's the wrong word, but I become too interested in broader things. And it was a time when the universities were being hit really hard with the government funding was difficult. The other big thing that happened was I went to a lecture by Mike Pence, who was head of physics at the Open University. And he had started this thing called Scientists Against Nuclear Arms. And he was one hell of a speaker. And I was so enthralled by this that I signed up on the spot. And within months, I was on the National Steering Committee and I was going around the country giving talks. And I ended up being so this is my spare time thing, being the research coordinator for Scientists Against Nuclear Arms. That still exists actually in a new guise. It's called Scientists for Global Responsibility. The reason I'm telling you that is that slightly knocked my confidence in, do I really have what it takes to be a scientist for the rest of my life? And I was thinking about marriage and kids and stuff. I don't know. And there's part of me that thinks, you should have just stayed with the love of when you were a 12-year-old, you wanted to be a scientist. But in a sense, I said, no, I'm going out to the big bad world. And I used my computing experience, of which I picked up a huge amount from my research work. You can't solve Schoen's equation with two molecules coming together without doing a lot of computing. I got a job doing computer-aided design, and initially for manufacturers, things like cars and stuff, and then that led into chip design. So I was writing chip design software for Philips, who were big into ASICs and semiconductors. And again, I felt, oh God, I'm getting into a niche. I'm doing a niche thing again. I want to broaden out. And so the job that really, again, was a revelation was moving into general business computing, which meant I was then walking into departments like legal firms, pharmaceuticals. And I think because I come from a large family, I love integrating and mixing with people. I'm not the sort of person that likes to be behind a cubicle coding, because I love that kind of human interaction and the intellectual challenge. A law firm coming in saying, we want to build a know-how system. Ooh, I love that. It combines my human side with ability to deal with complex issues and problems. And I was like, that was a revelation. And I found I was really good at it. And the rest, the 30 years of consulting in enterprise content management followed from that job. So I hope that explains it. But it tells a little bit about me. And I think bringing together skills which are not always articulated well in CVs and things. You can't say, I come from a large family, therefore I know how to mix with different personalities and stuff. That doesn't necessarily look good on a CV, but I think it was a big part of me, a big part of how I managed to be successful.
First off, feel free to elaborate on your answers. This is a long form interview, so no worries there. I think that's part of one of these threads here. But I think that's part of the challenge with evaluating talent is how we do it, right? I don't know a better way that we can put somebody's personality or what makes them good or bad at doing a thing other than a CV. But I think so much of the talent evaluation process is lost because we're trying to put everybody into a box to make somebody else's job easier. But that's just a bit of an aside. I wrote down some questions that I wanted to follow up on. I think some I'll earmark for later. But one of the things that stuck out to me was you said you didn't think that you had what it takes to be a scientist. So I think then that's where you made a pivot, right? What do you mean by that? At the time, what were the variables that you were considering when you thought of a life as a scientist versus a life in a career in the big bad world, as you put it?
Yeah, a number of factors probably came into play. My mother was always anxious about money. She came from quite a poor background of tenant farming things and then was really bright and did well. But there was a part of me that said, I don't want to get into a position where I'm worrying about money all the time. And the way I looked at it at the time, it seemed like you were having to chase grants every 18 months. And I have friends. I have a very good old friend, and she's a professor of immunology and has done brilliantly in her career. And I think I had the intellectual capabilities doing it. It's whether I had the stomach to deal with the fact that I could be quite poor for a lot of the time and just about to start a family. I'd met the love of my life and we were talking about starting a family. And I thought, I just don't want that stress. And maybe I didn't think I had the stomach to do the kind of things my friend does, which is just this dogged focus on this one area. And I made a choice, and it sounds like I'm regretting it, but I don't think I do really regret it because I think it was right for me. And it gave me, I still got a lot of intellectual stimulation because I was always being thrown into these really difficult challenges. So in a way, I got that intellectual stimulation and I maintained, obviously not a research level, but I maintained an interest in science, which has come back to be useful later in life with some of that climate change stuff and so forth. But so, yeah, it was a choice. And it was a difficult choice, and I probably cried for 2 days.
I just had a conversation about this the other day, but it's easy to look back on moments like that with rose-colored glasses. And I know you're not saying like you regret it, but like to play the what-if game. But I'm sure that you made the best choice you could with the information that you had at the time, considering the variables at the time. And to me, it seems like life is messy and life can be complicated and it's not as linear as we would like it to be. And that was a practical choice to propel you and your family forward, considering all the variables at the time.
Yeah.
I do think that it's so much of our experience. I use AI a lot and for a bunch of different random things. And I was doing some reflecting on the podcast And like, I think I've published like 34 episodes so far. And I was these conversations are with people from different domains and different backgrounds. And the conversations all have the same through line, but we get there differently. And one of the things, like, I think it was Notebook app, and I had to analyze the podcast every episode. And it said, I'm obsessed with inputs. And I think it's spot on, because your input, or some of your inputs from when you were growing up, was your mother's anxiety around financial stability because of her background. That's an input. That input shaped how you think about things and how you approach the world and how you make decisions. And that's not to say that's right or wrong. It just comes back to inputs. And that's like, these conversations I find enlightening why I do it, but I just find it fascinating that the environments that we're in, the information that we take in, shape then who we become. And I think it's a superpower for those of us who can like reflect on that and understand how we got to where we're at, because I don't think that ability is lacking probably in the general population, just as an aside.
Yeah, the examined life and all that.
Yeah. In preparation for the interview, you sent me some information. I did some of my own research as well. But one of the things that kept coming up was one I've heard from a former colleague of yours. In addition, you had spoke about it in one of your bios I read, that the clients that you worked with looked at you as a trusted partner. And in addition to that, I also noticed, and maybe you could elaborate on this a little bit, of it seems like asking questions, and more specifically asking why questions, was a big part of how you were successful in your career. Two parts. One, why do you think customers viewed you or worked with you as a trusted partner? And do you think that was related to your curious questions about where they're at and what they're trying to accomplish, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that was part of it. I think building trust and empathy, people, there's a process, a methodology. It doesn't always have to be, it's not step one, step two. A lot of the things that I end up doing, the context was important, because quite often they'd had a lot of technology thrown at them. And sometimes it stuck to the wall okay, but other times not so much. And so the reason I was coming in was because they were saying, look, we got all this technology. We were promised nirvana and another silver bullet, and it's not happening for us. That wasn't always the context, but quite often there was a context around that. And so I would say, look, I need to talk to everybody. When I say everybody, representatives, so it's really senior people on the shop floor in between, and have conversations, understand what their needs are, what their concerns were. And you quite often have the experiences, no one's been listening to me forever, and now you seem to be listening to me. So that was the kind of thing of just the fact that I wasn't just throwing more technology at the problem. I was trying to get behind what were the real issues and use consulting methods like I came up with lots of things, doing benefits maps and maturity models and stuff, and trying to, you're saying you want to be here, but currently you're down here. How do we bridge that gap? All of those kinds of consulting techniques. But I think it's that approach of listening to people, playing it back, trying to get consensus amongst groups. I think, oh gosh, we're actually getting to the fundamentals here. And it isn't all about license sales, which meant I had this very interesting relationship when I was working with those technology-focused companies, which had a side consulting organization, whereas there could be sometimes they could have liked me, but don't get in the way of the set. Don't overcomplicate it. And I was saying, it'll get complicated. It just might take a few years before they realize they don't have the plan to actually make this stuff actually truly work for them. So I'm either going to go in earlier or they'll be calling for it later. Yeah. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think it is making an attempt to build relationships and work with the networks within organizations. There was one project in West Africa where it was quite a large, prestigious organization. And actually, this was, interestingly, I think this is quite common, actually. I found someone who themselves was trusted, who was very rarely the most senior person in the organization. It was someone in the middle who already had a fantastic network, and then they would help open the doors. So it's also about using those networks sometimes to find ways to accelerate the process of finding the right conversations to have with the right people.
So a couple follow-ups on that. One of the things that I saw, and maybe I shouldn't say this on a podcast that's going to be public, but I'm really challenged with leadership in organizations. And by challenged, I don't think generally they're good leadership. And my theory is I had worked with an executive coach years ago. He's been on the podcast. His name's Randall Osché. And Randall Osché wrote this book called How to Get a Job in Any Economy, something like that. We'll include it in the show notes. Nonetheless, the premise of the book was like how people get jobs. And he wrote an entire book, and the through line of the book that he like reiterated in each chapter, so much so that on the last page of the book, it has this phrase. And the phrase is, you get jobs by talking to people. And this was probably over maybe close to 10 years ago or so that I started working with Don. But until that point in time, I always thought that you got promoted because you were good at something or because you were a hard worker. But then I got to a plateau in my career. I read the book. I hired Don to coach me. And what I have come to find out is my current philosophy is that you actually don't get jobs by being the hardest worker, the most competent person. You get jobs based on relationships. And we can see this in organizations. For instance, I used to work at Wells Fargo, or a version of Wells Fargo Advisors specifically. Their CEO was hired years ago. His name's Charlie Scharf. Charlie Scharf came from JP Morgan. Shortly thereafter, Charlie Scharf comes from JP Morgan. The version of Wells Fargo I worked for was Wells Fargo Advisors. We were without a CEO. So then they hire Barry Summers. Guess where Barry Summers used to work? JP Morgan. You can't tell me that Charlie Scharf went out into the marketplace, did an interviewing process the same way he expects lower level employees to go through an interviewing process to find whoever it is they want to hire. Charlie Scharf seemingly, I wasn't part of these conversations, but Charlie Scharf seemingly hired his friend, somebody who had a former relationship with. Now, this isn't to say that Barry Summers is incompetent or a hard worker, but the number one driving factor there was the relationship with Charlie Scharf.
Yeah.
I think that's quite evident. Now, the challenge, getting back to the leadership, my stance on leadership as it exists today, is that when you do that and you don't go out into the marketplace and you don't look for the most competent, hardest working person, but you hire who you like the most, who you think is going to challenge you the least, you lose something there, right? You lose some competence, you lose some ability and attributes that other higher performing individuals have. So you create this, I think, trickle down effect of, dare I say it, like stupidity or incompetence. Now, that's maybe a bit brash, but nonetheless, that's how I think about this. And maybe that's more of an exception than the rule, or maybe it's the rule and there's an exception, but I've experienced this like myself in my probably 20 some years of work experience so far. When I hear you talk and when I read some of the information about what you've written before, and I think just in your prior comments, you said there's a lack of leadership because senior management always wants a technological silver bullet. I would love to get your thoughts on my rant there, but then maybe as the rant applies to your experience with leadership, because I even think that you said it, that you were looking for trusted individuals in organizations, and it was the exception where this particular leader was a trusted individual, and that usually doesn't happen. So any thoughts around leadership in organizations, how they make decisions, and maybe how there's a trickle-down effect of their, perhaps your opinion differs from mine, competency to incompetency?
Yeah, there's some big questions. I suppose in my little introduction that I sent you, I was perhaps talking about leadership in the context of enabling change, which is partially enabled by technology, but also requires a whole lot of other stuff, like culture change and changing practices and so forth. So I was very much talking within that context. I do agree with you. There can be problems when you look at board level and you see this kind of revolving door of different people seemingly jumping between these top companies, and they seem to be there and then they're there. You think, how did that work? So I think you're onto something there. But my concern was if we're trying to create this learning organization, for example, or we're trying to create culture change where we use our knowledge more effectively to take the company forward. So that was the world I was in as a work. So that was the context in which I felt leadership was failing. And I think partly, even if they were good leaders in terms of managing the P&L, the company and all that stuff and supply chain and whatever else they were grappling with, when it came to things that they thought were going to be solved by technology, it was almost like they'd probably get in the big hitter consultants who are going to do the great PowerPoint pitch and everything. They sign the check and then it says, tell me when it's finished. That's almost like what it feels like. So there's a lack of genuine engagement in the process going through and understanding enough about how that process should work. They would never do that if it was a new headquarters, if it was a new building. They would be on site looking at it and saying, oh, why have we got that big window there and da-da-da. They would have a visceral interest in that building. But when it comes to this kind of invisible world of information and knowledge, somehow they lose interest or they think, oh, the techies will go away and do that, even though this stuff is actually fundamental to the processes and effective processes of the organization. And they just don't seem to get it. And maybe they're frightened of technology. Maybe I can't always explain it because I think it is such a, and I've got so many, I include them in the book, but I've got a number of horror stories of how that's happened. I can tell you one if you like.
Please.
Yeah, and this actually wasn't necessarily just about information management. It was about core processes within a bank. So they had this old COBOL system that was written, and the people were beginning to retire who nurtured this system. Anyway, they'd got the pitch which said, with all this regulation changing, it takes you 9 months to change the system to actually reflect new regulations and so forth. You need Agile, an Agile core platform in order to deal with the agility which is happening in the market. So they got in a big package. I don't even have to name it. It begins with S and ends in P. And they got in the big six who were going to outsource development to wherever. And it was almost, go away and come up with it. Now, what happened? Of course, the middle management wanted the new system to look like the old system. But they bent the platform so out of shape that it was going to be just as costly to maintain as the old system, in many ways worse, because they had to deal with every upgrade that came from the new platform. And they ended up with a kind of monster. And senior management was surprised by this. But they didn't ask any of those questions. Those questions as a curious mind. Okay, how are we going to make sure that this system is upgradable and continues to be agile? It's an obvious question to me, but it seems like those questions are not being asked because, again, it's go away tech, come back, we've got this silver bullet, this wonderful package, and it's all going to happen by magic, apparently, without curious minds challenging them on it. And we see this with the big projects a lot. So I think it's that lack of intellectual curiosity as much as anything that I find astounding often with the senior people who are put in that position where really the things they're dealing with, it's not changing the car parking layout. This is fundamental to the business to get these things right.
I think that my sort of like rant there was maybe taking what you're talking about at a higher level and you're talking about a symptom of what I think is a larger problem. Like you're identifying or you identified that leadership as it related to your work specifically weren't doing an effective job with managing this process of incorporating the technology or understanding that technology is a piece of a broader picture, but also like change management and what culture did you create that's going to facilitate this change, whether people are going to be open to it or not. That would be, to me, like a pillar of leadership. And it seems like you have experience, maybe not everywhere, but where that was a pain point and a failure upon leadership to ineffectively and inefficiently lead in one of these areas. I was speaking in more broad terms from like a 30,000 foot view. I'm not a psychologist. Maybe we're going down a rabbit hole, but we can get out of this in a second. I find though, like you said about the building, because it's visceral. You can go into the new headquarters as it's under construction, put on the hard hat, play a construction superintendent for a day and be like, that looks good. That doesn't look good. You can see it. You can feel it. You can imagine it. But I think that's a really good example of people managing what they can comprehend. And I often find in organizations, they focus on what they can comprehend and these larger, more complex problems that require better questions to be asked, that require deeper thinking, that require a bit more strategy and thought and maybe working across silos. those problems that are worth solving, you said fundamental to business, often go unaddressed because they are complex, because it does require deeper level of thinking. Then focus, instead of doing that, which would be fundamental to the business, oftentimes humans, and leaders are humans, focus on things that require less intellectual calories to be burned, i.e. your headquarter example.
Yeah. I don't know. I think sometimes it's about power. It's about power as well within organizations. So if you go down the functional hierarchies within organizations, they have power. So if there's something that's going to affect this department, they're happier if things that they can control are happening within their silos. So I'll tell you another story, which is in the book, actually. I worked across many sectors, but this happens to be another bank, a Nordic bank. But again, I was asked to go in and take a cross-the-board look at what they'd been doing. And one of the first questions I asked was, so how many processes do you have? And I was astonished. They actually had an answer. It was something like 700. I said, okay, so where are these? Where are they documented? The risk department had banks of lever arch files with these things documented. But if you took something like a loan process, it was actually salami sliced into the different departments. So if there was 5 departments touch the process, there would be 5 processes. And if there were 7 different types of loan, there would be 5 times 7, 35 different processes. And then when you asked them, have you attempted to do any optimization around this? Oh yeah, we've had 6 Sigma guys in to help us. But they'd optimize what happened in each department. So what I did was said, I think I was quite brave doing a lot of this stuff I did, which I said, I tell you what, if you can give me, and I think it's going to need to be about 15, 20 people that touch this process in different ways from different departments, representatives in a room for 2 days, I can really help here. So we'll take the loan process, and then I filled a wall with paper, again, giving it that visceral element, instead of sitting in the corner trying to do a process mock. So we're going to look at the end-to-end process. We're going to forget about our departmental silos, and we're going to follow the loan dossier as it passes through the different departments and use the technique, which is really powerful. It's called role activity modeling. But basically, it ignores all the hierarchies. It doesn't do all this nonsense about 5-level deep hierarchies of processes, which was used in chemical engineering and somehow got taken up by all the big 6. So you have armies of people mapping processes, and it's completely meaningless to the business. So what I was doing, they understood immediately. It was looking at this way in which information flows across the business. And I got them to bring in all the documents that they used during the process, and there were about 30 of them stuck on the wall, of which at least immediately it was obvious that half of them were redundant because they were just moving data from one department to another. And immediately they realized, actually, there's things happening in parallel that should be happening in series that should be happening in parallel. And they left, and I put this into a package to document this thing. And by 9 o'clock the following morning, they all had 8 large printouts of the as is. I had the chief financial officer popped his head in, and this was probably about 8 o'clock in the evening when I was still working. And I said, so Richard, what's this? And I said, explain what it was. And he immediately zoomed in. He said, that's the wrong document. It was a Basel document about regulations. He said, they're using the wrong version. And no one had ever seen the whole process end to end before because they were all these salami slicing. And the next day, I gave them a 20-minute masterclass in document management, single source of the truth, role-based access, blah, blah. Doesn't take long. And then I just basically coached them through with a clean sheet of paper about as big as this. I'm talking 5 meters, 2 meters high, 5 meters long. And we did the 2B process. And apparently after when I left, they had a party and they'd put a clear film on the floor and they put the as-is, the 2B and the as-is underneath. And they used the party to have a kind of interactive thing about it. It was really quite interesting. But I did that in 2 days. Now, the big 6 approach back in the day would have been to have an army of 15 junior consultants mapping out 5 levels of process. And it would have been really opaque. They'd have then thrown in a package like SAP or something like that. And the techies would say, actually, SAP doesn't work like that. So they had to rework it. So in terms of simple versus complex, I don't think it's about simple versus complex. I think it is about clear thinking versus muddied, poor approach, shall we say, to processes, which is there to protect these power silos, which they're not such silos because of some arbitrary reason. It's because these silos are created and partly protected by the power relationships that exist within the leadership structure organizations. They can be difficult to break down.
couple things in there. Maybe the theme for today is just my corporate frustration, or like me raising what you've experienced in your career to a higher root cause, perhaps. But I haven't had direct experience with Big Six. However, from your story and from my proximity to it in my career, there's two things that I noticed that come out of that. And it's not exclusive to the Big Six, but I think they're guilty of it as well. But doing work that's busy versus being productive, and then misunderstanding doing tasks for the objective. What I mean by that, like the first one is somebody can be busy, right? You can be busy digging a hole all day, right? You can dig a hole all day. But if what you actually needed was a trench, then the hours you spent shoveling were busy, but they weren't productive. The next day you got to go back and realize that I should have dug a trench. Those hours, 8 hours you invested in digging straight down, didn't get you to where you needed to be. Busy, but not productive.
Yeah.
And then like recently, I've really been thinking about accomplishing the objective instead of accomplishing the task. Tasks need to be accomplished to lead to an objective, but I think oftentimes people don't understand what they're trying to accomplish, or like your approach in that story with that bank wasn't to create the most amount of work possible or to come in with a large team and to do charts and graphs and make this a laborious activity. Your remit was to unify this process, have a single source of truth, and make it a more effective and efficient process. And then how that technology works with that. I think oftentimes that gets lost in the work that we do day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is important. That's only one dimension of, if you like, my concerns on that. And the book, my book.
Yeah.
This book. I do spend a little bit of time talking about leadership, but it's one section, however many sections it is, 50 or whatever. And I think leadership pertains to a lot of the other aspects I talk about. It's not being awe of the latest thing. Some years ago, it was like, everyone needs to be a coder. So I've got a section in here, which is called the zeitgeist of the coder, which is saying why, challenging that question. And now everything, AI is going to solve everything. I think the other thing is that fads can somehow not address some of the fundamental issues like culture and practice. And I use this, actually, I talk about this issue of what I'm calling now information hygiene, which is people sending email attachments around organizations and so forth. And then you're getting 50 different versions of the same document allegedly scattered around stores in the organization, which in a properly managed situation wouldn't happen. I use the analogy of a surgical team who scrub up religiously and sterilize their instruments before they go into theater. And that would be true in Mumbai, in New York, in London, in Nairobi. It's part of the culture and it's part of the practice. A lot of organizations do not have that culture, and it seems to be that we let them get away with it. It's almost like hospitals wouldn't mind if the head surgeon came in from doing their gardening and did a cursory wash and went straight into theater. It's almost like we allow that to happen in organizations. And so I think we do have, and I think some of those bad habits were learned really early on in the kind of the world of everyone with their C drives and so forth. And I think it's not universal. There's certainly some sectors where that is absolutely not true. And there's some niches within larger organizations where it certainly is not true, because and it's not all about failure. It's about the successes, but there's too much of the bad stuff happening. And I suspect, even though I retired 10 years ago, I suspect it's still an uphill struggle. And so for me, I think it's about bringing these three elements together, which is, if you like, the soft skills thing, which is leadership. It's about clear vision. It's about systems thinking. The technology, yes, we need the technology. And then there's this third bit, which is the culture and practice. And I think that if you think of those as three legs of a stool, too often, I think people imagine that you can do it all with one leg, which is the technology. And the current leg is AI, but in the past it was something else. There's always been something in play which people have been claiming is going to suddenly fix all the problems. And I find that frustrating because I know from experience that you need the other two legs of the stool to make it work. Yeah.
I actually, in my work, as a value engineer. Sometimes I include one of my last slides of my presentation, that sort of Venn diagram of three circles, and where they overlap. The three circles are technology, people, and process. And where they overlap, I have another fourth circle, little, right? And it's success. Because you can have the greatest technology, but if you don't have the right people to use it, it's not going to be successful. If you can have the right technology and people, but you lack a process for implementation, like your bank story from earlier, then it's not going to be successful. But it really is, in this scenario, for me, technology, people, and process. It can't ever be like one thing. Whatever those pillars of success would be, it's going to be multiple. It can't just be, we're going to buy the best technology, forget about it, and it's going to manage our entire company.
Yeah. And I'm sure you do this in your work, but the thing I stress is then, okay, when we come to process, what are those things? And in the knowledge area, it's for simple things sometimes, like at the end of a project, actually budgeting time to do a proper kind of review, hopefully involving the client, and actually feeding that back into practice aids and so forth. So it isn't just rushing to the next project and good stuff happens, bad stuff happens, but it's trying to do more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. But you don't do that if you don't have a culture of learning. But to have a culture of learning, you've got to have some sense in which you have some sort of trusted knowledge base, which is those nuggets which are really going to give the practitioner the insights they need to really, whatever kind of project it is, whether it's building a bridge or in our case, building knowledge systems and so forth.
Let's take a quick break from today's episode. If you're enjoying the conversation, take a second to like, follow, or subscribe wherever you're tuning in. We'd really appreciate it. You can also find us on Instagram at Randall Osché. That's RANDALLOSCHE. And check out more at podcast.randallosché.com, including show notes and other resources from today's episode. All right, back to the conversation.
I want to pivot to the book a little bit more structurally here. Two things I think I want to get into now. One, I think that you seem to be a man of varied interest. I look at myself as a man of varied interest, probably to my detriment at times. I try to be increasingly more focused on certain things, but I think I'm intellectually curious about things. And when I look at a product or a system or dynamic, I want to know more about that thing. I started a podcast. I didn't know anything about podcasting. And one of the most stimulating parts of this was to figure out how to have a podcast, right? It's just not as simple of, I'm going to get the subscription to Riverside.fm, get somebody to be a guest and make that happen, right? But I fight myself every day for going down new rabbit holes that would be like starting a new podcast. But with the book titled Trusted Knowledge in a Digital and Fragmented World, I think published June of 2024, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe that was 8 or so years after you had retired. What led you to write the book?
I suppose a desire to try and get something out there, because I felt as though quite often with clients, I was finding a situation of sort of Groundhog Day of them not having had experience of some of the concepts and ideas I'd become used, if you like, to conveying. And in the book, I've got a kind of 100 diagrams that I've made myself, which all originated from a whiteboard where they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but where I would be using pictures to explain things, to clarify an idea or to resolve conflicting ideas. And I wanted to share it. I'd actually written something. There was a bid that went out, oh gosh, was it 20 years ago? 30, yeah, it was a long time ago. But it went out, and when I was working for Praxis Deloitte, it was around intellectual property. And the exam question blew my head away, because I said, these people have asked the right questions. Way! So, they'd ask things about how do we deal with preserving the longevity of content over years? How do we break down silos? And so they're asking all these great questions. And I said, we're trying to do some of that stuff. So I literally, within a week, I wrote a 150-page methodology document, and we got it framed. We flew to Geneva, and I had a few copies of this. We sat down, and there was an interview panel which involved, it must have been 15 people. And we passed this thing around and it went round the table and they were flicking through it and they were looking at each other and they're going like this. And we completely blew away the competition. IBM, Deloitte, etc. They just didn't stand a chance, basically, because it was one of those things, moments in life when you were in the right place at the right time to do that thing. And I thought, this could be the basis for a book. But it took me 20 years to get around to writing the book. And I learned so much during that process because a lot of the things that were, so in there I had how to do ECM basically from a strategic point of view, not just technical point of view, but how to deal with language, how to deal with versioning and of large complex entities, how to deal with processes and doing some of that role activity modeling and how to resolve the issues around silos. So I had all that stuff in there, but I didn't have all the experience of all the 20 more years of experience. And every time I thought, I think I should try and write it now, another project came along with more insights. So it almost needed me to retire for me to find the time. And then it took me 2 years to write it. And then I thought, do I have the stomach to go out and find a publisher? And anyway, most of my clients were spread around the world anyway, everywhere from Mumbai to California to the Nordics and Africa and so on. And a friend of mine said, look, Richard, just get it out of your system. You need to get it out of your system because I've been bugging him for ages about this. And so I did. I got it out of my system, I self-published. And of course, I don't have the marketing behind me to do much with it. So I'm just hoping it's going to, at some point, find a spark where it will take off. But I could see that a lot of my old colleagues could make use of this. But it was, I suppose, a really slow burn, but I think in a good way, because I think I was able to reflect on those experiences and bring together a lot of insights which came from 3 decades. It addresses the knowledge issue in a way that technology is a necessary condition, but it's not in itself sufficient because it's about how you use the technology. People talk about metadata, but then I go into what are the different kinds of ways in which you can create vocabularies. And how does that work actually in practice? And I tell the story of a large engineering consultancy that I went to see, and they're world leading. And they had a project database, and they had a field called keyword. And within a short time, I said, look, you're suffering from keyword entropy, which is basically people are making up new keywords because they can't find the one they want and so on and so forth. And so I had a lot of discussions with them. And I said, well, I think you need 3 control vocabularies to deal with the things you build, cinema and theatres, airports and so forth, geography, and then the other one was partnerships with architects and so on. And I said, if you use as a standard thesaurus for each of those, you can then maintain those vocabularies so they're going to be resilient in the future. You'll be able to find things which have old language in them, and you'll be able to find things which have new language in them, and you'll be able to relate those things as well, so they won't get split apart. And I put that on a whiteboard, and again, the jaws dropped because they'd never had that conversation. And the interesting thing was, years later, I met some of the people that worked there, and they said, look, we went through 3 different technology platforms, green screens, client server, web-based, but the underlying information architecture pretty much stayed the same because we put the effort into trying to get that right. And so it's trying to build that kind of resilience as well into it, because a lot of, in fact, all these industries, I guess if you're selling burgers, maybe you don't need this, but most of the sectors we deal in had in some sense, either long value chains, if you're developing a pharmaceutical, or if it's a national library, was the last project I did, you have the need to maintain that content over hundreds of years. In different ways, they have the need for kind of resilience and in terms of how they deal with knowledge and content. And so all of those kinds of topics were key to writing the book, but it was having those multiple different stories and those different sectors and different clients that helped flesh it out and give it real life. You can back things up with real life stories, even though the names have been changed, included just to protect the innocent. Yeah.
So your book is a reflection on your career, what worked for you, what resonated with organizations, what helped them move forward. Part of, I think, what enabled you to have the success you did to write the book and get it out there was your ability or drive to be curious, right? Where do you think in yourself that curiosity comes from?
But it's difficult to say, isn't it? I think all children, when people say, oh, I was no good at science at school, I was no good at art and something, I think every child is potentially an artist or a scientist. It's just somehow the education system can sometimes convince them, no, they're no good at art and they're no good at science. And I think I managed to maintain an interest in both, actually. But I had to make a decision when I was a kid, you had to choose which route. And I went down the science route. And it's only in retirement I've come back to my art. But luckily, I didn't listen to the voices that said, you can't do this. So I just, it frustrates me that, if you like, that kind of curiosity somehow leaves people for some reason. But it isn't as strong as it could be, shall we say. But, again, the why. Kids do that naturally when they're 3.
Yeah.
It's a shame that sometimes they get to 30 and they've lost it. And they're doing the what, but not challenging back and saying why.
So coming from finance, wealth management, and banking, and then with my experience in technology the last 4 years, I have found this to be true in both of those environments, that there's a lack of curious questions being asked. And I don't know where it comes from in me, but I do want to know the why behind things. I remember this going back to playing high school sports and asking coaches, like, why are we doing it this way? Help me understand, because if I can understand what this person is doing and why they're doing it, perhaps that's going to affect my performance. And I think that's a good question to be asked. But the coach at the time was like, you don't need to know that because that's not your job. That's a shitty answer.
No, it's a bad answer.
But
yeah.
So going back as far as I can remember, that I would say is like probably the rule of the response of like, why do you need to know this, or you don't need to know this? And then as I've gone through my career and I've managed people and I've tried to coach them to help them do a better job, they have been afraid to ask deeper questions. They've been reluctant to ask deeper questions of clients, right? Like a business to consumer environment and then a business to business environment in technology of, why do you do this thing, or what's important to you, or why are we having this conversation? Yeah, I don't know what that reluctance is, but I think asking curious questions can drive people to a lot of success. And if somebody out there is listening to this and they aren't doing that, maybe try.
Yeah, and it can be the individual, but it can be the culture. If you've got a kind of culture of, not of fear, but almost of for rocking the boat or anything like that, then people naturally won't ask questions. I never had that problem. Whenever I go to a lecture, even now, I'm the one sitting at the front with my notebook and my pen. I'm taking notes and I ask questions and I'm curious, I'm interested. And I always thought at university, I kept putting my hand up and challenging. Am I being stupid here? He wasn't clear. She wasn't clear. So can you explain it, please? And other people afterwards over a drink, they'd be saying, I'm glad you asked that question because I was confused as well. I said, why didn't you ask the question? It seems like there's a reluctance sometimes to appear stupid in a university context, but in a kind of business context. I've worked in the Middle East, for example, and there can be a cultural thing where the senior guy doesn't like to be embarrassed. So you have to find a way of asking the question sometimes. So sometimes it might be in a one-to-one. You say, why do you do it this way? Well, so we've always done it this way. And it's quite difficult to change. And then you can ask the question of the big guy and say, I'm curious, why do we do it this way? Oh, and you might get a different response. But sometimes there can be reasons for being sensitive to the dynamics or the culture of the organization to not necessarily go in with all guns blazing. But I do think there is a reticence about being curious. And a lot of problems have happened in projects and so forth and in organizations happen because of this lack of curiosity. And we see it every day of the week in the news. And it can be very frustrating. So I think we need more people who are brave enough to put their hand up and challenge received wisdom or challenged assertions or assumptions. Yeah.
Agreed. We're going to work towards wrapping this up.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time. A couple of things I want to cover before I let you go. One, man of varied interest. Is that how you think you would define yourself?
Yeah.
Do you think that has been a net positive for you or a net negative for you, for however you would want to measure that?
A net positive. Yeah, definitely. And the only thing I'd add would be it's making time for those things. So it's making time for my painting, for example. I'm active in a local climate group. Sometimes that can overwhelm you with various projects that one's involved in, and one has to then carve out the time to do the art as well. And of course, there's family as well. It's trying to have a balance of all those things that make capture your attention and interest.
Final questions I like to ask all guests. What's the most influential book that you have ever read?
A single one. I think probably in terms of the effect it had on what I did subsequently. I think Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything is probably up there. There are others, but that gave me a kick up the, that was 2014. Climate change was there, and I had the science to know that it was a real problem, but it was like the damp patch in the corner of the room where you push the sofa in front of it and you ignore it because it's going to be massive. I intuitively knew that if I got involved, because I tend to be all in, I'm not half in sort of person, I'm an all in sort of person. So I knew, and she really just, that book. And I went to see her speak at Literary Festival and got a signed copy. In fact, I brought it along, so it's here with a signed copy. That was pretty. So I 10 years later, I'm still doing stuff around climate change. And I think probably she was the kick up the butt, as you'd say in this US, to get into doing stuff about it.
If your younger self could see you now, what would they be most proud of?
Oh, there's too many dimensions to that. Obviously, having a lovely family. So I wouldn't want to rank these. I think my family is fantastic and they're doing so well and everything, and grandchildren now. I think in terms of, if you like, taking a broader perspective on in terms of my work and so forth, it is I suppose I've stayed true to my passions. I've shown integrity, I feel, and built trusted relationships and so forth with many people in different ways. And I feel I overcame perhaps those insecurities that existed when I was at school and somehow managed to find a voice. So I think overall that young boy would be saying, well done, you did okay, you did all right. Yeah.
And the traditional question I always like to ask is, what's one piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
Don't doubt yourself so much. The examined life is important. I think overconfidence, never wanted to turn out to be a narcissist, but you can go too far the other way sometimes and be doubting yourself too much. So I would say trust in your instincts and trust in your capacities, because you're going to do okay.
I like that. Final question. This should be an easy one. We'll include all the links to this answer in the show notes. But if people want to find the book, if people want to reach out to you, where can they go find you at? What's your website? Do you have any social media use that you use that young people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I tend to have, there's a website for the book, trustedknowledge.org, and it has and I'll add a link to this conversation when it arrives. But that's a place where you can find it. It's available on Amazon in hardback, softback, or ebook. But there's a description on the website of some of what it's about and so forth. And in terms of social media, on Instagram, that's mainly art and stuff. On Blue Sky and on LinkedIn. And for family mainly, I'm on Facebook. Yeah, you can find me, and I tend to try and include the links, and I'll make sure I'll just check with the trustedknowledge.org that I've got the social media links on that website, because I've got some other websites. I've got one for my art, and I've also got one where I put essays on around climate change and so forth.
We'll include them all. We'll include them all so people can find you and check you out. One of the last pieces here, as I tried to land this plane, when I was reviewing either your website or some of the exchanges that we had leading up to this conversation, but you had said no experience or knowledge should ever go to waste. So I want to say, Richard, thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. And it was a pleasure to have you on here, and it was a great conversation.
It's a pleasure for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
And that wraps up today's conversation on the Randall Osché Podcast. Thanks again to our guest for sharing their time, knowledge, and lessons with us. If the episode brought you any value, the best way to support the show is to follow or subscribe on your favorite platform. That helps us reach more people like you. You can also visit podcast.randallosché.com for blog posts, full transcripts, and other episode resources. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and keep moving forward.